We are stepping out beyond our normal boundaries this morning to share with you now two readings. The first is going to be the Gospel reading from Matthew, which is the one that set our whole conversation in motion. And then Afra is going to read for us a surah from the Quran. I was going to tell you why we chose it, but you'll see. It's a tiny text, but in my view it's the pivotally important text in Matthew for the shape of the Christian gospel. From here on out, the way of Jesus becomes this incarnation of the merciful, healing heart of God, not just for his own people, but for all people.
So we talked about this passage, and I thought about something similar in our tradition. And then I remembered a passage from the Quran in which also the Prophet Muhammad is approached by a blind man in the midst of an important conversation with important people. He frowned and turned away from him. Now I will subject you to my Arabic recitation. Having this beautiful team behind me, I have to tell you that every child learns to recite the Quran, but to each is his musical level, so please bear with me. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Abasa wa tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma wa ma yudrika la'allahu yazzakka أو يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى. When we chose these two texts, we wanted to look at not whose religion was better and not which one was more truthful. If you have noticed, that has not worked for us on this planet. Perhaps there's a different way of engaging, perhaps a different way that reflects what the prophets, what the sages, what the enlightened ones wanted from us, to look beyond our noses and beyond our identities.
And in his encounter with this woman, he begins to realize that God is bigger than he had imagined, that God's love is wider, that God's mercy extends far further than he had hitherto imagined. Now that's all fine, but a lot of you may know that traditional interpretation about Jesus is that he never put a foot wrong, right from the cradle, right? No crying he makes. What excites me about this text is that Jesus is eventually open to the wisdom that comes from the margins. But he was cranky to start with, just like the rest of us. That I find really encouraging. And I could take us off on a whole other rabbit trail to talk about the persistence of the woman. But that's what I find intriguing about this text. How does the one that we follow, how did he learn the wisdom if it wasn't through increasing and expanding encounter?
So what I find intriguing about this text, and it's actually a voice representing the divine source, rebuking the Prophet Muhammad for having ignored a blind man, is that the Prophet Muhammad himself was very much committed to actually attending to the community, to the poor, to slaves, to women. In fact, the early members of the community were the marginal ones in society. And it was the rich and the leaders and the political leaders of his community that were very much disturbed by his call to equality, to justice, to compassion. They saw him, they perceived of him as someone who was threatening their economic privileges and interests, especially that Mecca was a commercial center in Arabia. And so he was already on that path of compassion, and this was his mission, and he was always attending to the poor, and he had created almost small communal systems of helping the poor, and he and his friends were freeing slaves as they were able to afford. And yet this incident takes place, fine-tuning him to even subtler levels of aversion or rejection that we practice. And I find that even though he's described as the messenger of compassion, Ar-Rahim, and that he was sent to humanity for mercy, to spread mercy, and that Islam has a universal message to all people from all backgrounds, yet the divine voice reminds him that you still have to fine-tune that you can't just be comfortable where you are, and that you have to
pick up on this piece that both the surah and our gospel text do, and that is to point us, to make Muhammad, to make Jesus, and to make those of us who read these texts go and look at the margins. Fascinated that both of our scriptures constantly talk about God's compassion towards the sick, the blind beggar, the poor, the widow, the orphan. Both of our traditions point there. So let me ask you this question. What happens then when the Quran and the scriptures talk about the margins? How do we who are comfortable get there? And I guess maybe I'll go first.
I think these two stories parallel each other or complement also each other, because in some ways they refer to that discomfort that we experience and the need to see the divine appear in unexpected places. In the case of Jesus, he was in a foreign land, out of his comfort zone. In the case of Muhammad, he was actually a little bit too much in a comfortable place where he also needed to challenge that, because he was in the center of power and talking to people of power. And sometimes we assign importance to powerful people, to rich people. And then here, when he is reprimanded for this, he is reminded that power is not where you think it belongs. It might actually belong to somebody very marginal and weak. That's not the way power works in the universe, he is being reminded. Walk this talk, Elisabeth. That's what I find, that as a Muslim, as a Christian, we have these beautiful passages about the poor, about the marginal, about the blind, and yet we live in a world where leaders, you probably have seen this past few days, where even Trump frowned and turned away from Merkel, who was pleading to him, let's welcome more refugees. He didn't even want to give a handshake. It was a moment that represented our world, and yet he is the one who wants to push Christianity. And yet there are these youthful Muslims who want to push Islam, and they're causing acts of terror or hatred because they think that's how they can support justice. How could we walk this talk and be a better Muslim and a better Christian in our small daily interactions? How could we bring this into our lives?
Not been the best of ourselves, not as a utter and final condemnation or failure, but one of those growth moments where we have the choice to look back on it and say, where is there wisdom? How can I take a wisdom from that moment into my life journey? So I'm looking at
this with a thought from our well-known Sufi poet Rumi, where he has something to teach us about truth when we come together. He said that when God created truth, he gave us a mirror. He gave humanity a mirror to reflect the brilliance of truth. And yet he didn't give us the mirror. God dropped the mirror and it smashed into many pieces. And now we have to put the pieces back together to reflect the brilliance of God back to him. And that's what we could do, and learn to see each other so that we actually reminded of how to actually love each other, because there could not be love without seeing each other and hearing each other and learning from each other. Thank you so much for having me amongst you as a sister and as an inside member. Really, thank you. Shukran.
Thank you.